Welcome to part 3 of our video series about getting started in 3ds Max. My name is Arnold Falder, and in this episode I'm going to show you a couple of methods how to create objects. We're going to start with simple objects with adjusting their parameters. We're going to add a few extended primitives, and then we try some Boolean operation. At the end of this unit, I'm also going to show you how to render a picture, how to set up the perspective, and render it and save it. Let's get started with some of the standard primitives, and I already showed you how to create boxes, so we have worked with boxes a lot. So let's start with creating one box here, and also in all the views I'm going to turn off the background grid and let's create some other object. So we're going through all those standard primitives, starting with the box. The next one is a sphere. And with the sphere, before you start creating a sphere, I'm quickly showing you, if you compare it here in front view, if you create a sphere, you will see that the sphere is created from the center. And that means if I create it in top view, this is where we always create our objects, the center of the sphere will be on the XY plane, so that while half the sphere is going down. That's why I don't create it this way, but before I start dragging it, I'm choosing sphere and I click base to pivot. That means when I create it now, it will put the pivot point in the base of the sphere, and they will both, so to say, stand on the same ground plane. Here's already the next object, that is plane, the ground plane. Here on the right side, the bottom here is a plane, and that is just like a rectangle. You can draw it, but it's a two-dimensional object only, so it only has length and width. It has no thickness. My ground plane. And on this ground plane, I'm now putting all my other objects. For example, here on the right side top, the cone. A cone, you start with dragging out a circular shape, then let the mouse go and define the height. Click again, and now the cone, of course, go either inward or outward. I'm going to all the way in, and I'm going to make the top 1, 0. We're going to take a look at the parameters a little bit later. Here's another sphere. It's called the geosphere, which is actually funny, but the geosphere is what made that I also do base to pivot, so I'm going to put the sphere right next to the other sphere. The difference between the two spheres, and I'm going to look here in my perspective view, and I'm also going to turn on F4, so I see all the edges. The geosphere is based on triangles, while the regular sphere is based on little quads, on little rectangles. So every one of those rectangles here in this sphere is actually flat. I know it doesn't look flat, it looks nicely smooth, but every rectangle here is flat, while here is the only flat thing is a triangle, and every triangle towards the next triangle already has a slight angle. So the creation method is based on the geometry is slightly different. Let's add another tube. Here is, of course, certain thickness of the tube, and there's a pyramid, just like the cone. Little pyramid. What else do we have? We have a cylinder, pretty simple shape, and a torus. Let's leave the torus out, and the teapot. And the teapot is a standard object that has been in 3D Studio Max for quite a while. The teapot is a little bit more complex object. It has several. It has a handle, and it has a lid, and so on, and it also casts shadows on itself, and has been an object to test performances. And if you have thousands of teapots, you can really bring your graphic card to the limits. Here is the teapot, and now we got two objects left here in the standard primitives. One is the torus, and the other one is the text plus element. The torus Here's one thing. The torus does not have the base to pivot option. So when you create the torus, and I'm doing this in the top right here, you can create the torus, but it will always stick into the ground plane, so only half the torus will be seen. But as soon as we go to the parameters later on, we can simply, as soon as we know what its radius is, we can lift it up move it up in C, the same amount of the radius, and then it will stay there. And the last thing will be the text plus. And text plus, when you click into the scene, will just create a piece of text. This text plus tool in the former versions of 3D Studio, the text was only available here as a shape, but in the geometry, now the text plus can also be added, and it automatically adds it as a 3D geometry. So when you add the text plus, here's a parameter. So I added it here. Then I can, for example, change the font. Let's call it 3D text. And the 3D text also has an option extrude, and when I hit the extrude, it will create, give him a height. We'll talk about more this when we talk about shapes and how to turn them into 3D geometry, but here is a standard feature already, and the font style and so on and so on. So let's just leave it there as 3D text. And here we are with all of our standard primitives are placed. Every one of those has a lot of parameters which can be adjusted. So for example, here's the tube, and when I select my tube and I select modify, that is the second category here in the command panel top. When I select modify with one object selected, I see its parameters. As soon as I select two objects, I don't see any parameters because it says two objects selected. So modify only works if you select one of them. So I select the tube here, and here I have the two radii, so radius 1 and radius 2. This is the inner radius and the outer radius. The height, of course, if I change it, here's the height. Then we have the height segment. So this is in how many segments will the height be divided. So that depends on what you're planning to do with it. If you are bending it somehow or twisting, you want to have more height segments. If you are not planning to do anything with the tubes, you can as well reduce them to 1. Of course, below 1 doesn't work. You need at least one segment here. The cap segments are the segments of those little edges up here, so that is usually is 1, and the amount of sides, and that's basically almost all the primitives have a sides somewhere. That means you know that all the geometry, it's a tube, but it's not perfectly round. It's not an object that has been created out of a circle extruded, but it's a standard primitive, and it has a limited amount of sides, in this case 18. If you want to render this and you want to get really close to it, you should for sure give it more than 18 sides, because you still see how many, you can see all the edges. So if you want to make it kind of smooth, you should go all the way, maybe double or 4 times. So let's go for 50. And as soon as you use 50 sides, you can see now it starts to get kind of smooth. Depends on how close you're there, the more sides you have on. Some other parameters, all the round spheres and torus and things like this, they also have a slice on function. I'm going to show you the slice on function here with the tube. When you hit the slice on and then you choose slice from and to, especially to, then you can only, for example, use a tube, because those values are degrees. So if I put 180 degrees, then it starts at 0 and it's only 180 degrees. It will then use the 50 sides all on 1/2, and that means it's even twice as fine. But that is a good way. That is slice on if you don't want. And it works with lots of them. Also, something is important, and that is also a setting that I did at the very beginning in part 0. Every standard primitive that is created in Max already has something that's called mapping coordinates. It means if you put a material and a texture on it, it knows how to place the material on it. It might not look good, but it knows at least how to place textures on it. Also, you don't want this button to be turned on because that means the mapping coordinates that are automatically created are real-world map size. Basically means that every texture is only 1 meter in size. So if you put a texture on it, it will be really small, depending on the size, of course, but it will be 1. So that means when you have real-world map size, you always have to place square textures on it that the pictures of the texture will cover exactly 1 by 1 meter. And usually textures don't do that, and I also want to change their sizes later on. So make sure real-world map size is not what's turned on, and generate map coordinates is usually turned on by default. Okay, so this is how you change the values. All of them have different values. Of course, a pyramid has much simpler. It's only width, length, width, and height. The pyramid can also have segments, so if you want to refine the pyramid, then you can define segments here 3 times and so on. The teapot, usually when you place a teapot here, it also has some additional parameters here, some checks you can define. Does the teapot have a body? Does it have a handle, a spout, and a lid? If you want an open teapot, just like this, leave the lid away. Also, if you place a teapot, it doesn't look good when it only has 8 segments. So teapots usually should have more than 8. This is already okay. In former Max versions, I think it had only 4 segments, the standard teapot. So 8 is already good, but I would suggest that you go up a little bit in order to make it a little bit more detailed. Okay, so those are all the things. We already talked about the text. Let's go to the torus. And the torus right now has 2 radii again. One radius, of course, is from the center to that defines the donut, and the second one defines the radius of this tube that is played around. So let's go for a radius of 10. And the other radius doesn't matter. This is the radius here, so it's 10. And I'm also going to use much more sides because it doesn't look good, and also segments, 50 segments. 50 segments is in this way, and sides is the other way. Now, the radius 2 is 10. That means if I take my torus now, and therefore I'm going to move, do a right-click on move, and I'm going to change its height to 10. That means now it stands on the ground plane. So if I look from the front, you can see that all your objects perfectly align by standing on the plane there. Good. So I don't need that anymore. That was some of the standard primitives. You can go through the rest of the objects. There is not only standard, but there's also extended primitives. Some things are a little different. Let's go for something simple. Here's an oil tank that is basically a cylinder with capsules on it. I don't know what the difference actually is. There a capsule? What is the difference between a capsule and a... Not much of a difference. The capsule is always perfectly rounded, while the oil tank can be adjusted, the radius up here. Of course, also the parameters there, when you go to modify, you want to make sure that the sides are enough, 30, so that it really looks nice and smooth, 30. Okay, so the spheres are fine, they usually look good. The cylinder does not. So here are some of the extended primitives. But the one thing that I would like to show you is a little bit more complicated object, and therefore I'm going to take my sphere and my torus, and I'm going to make a copy of it. So that's something you should already know how to do it. So here's my sphere and my torus, and I'm going to make sure that they overlap. So I'm going to make them overlap. It looks a little bit like a ring, or like a module for like a molecule model. So here they are. Let's move them away from the platform. Here there are two objects. And what I would like to show you is in the category geometry and so-called compound objects. Later on we go further into this, but compound objects are objects that are made out of more than one. And in our case, I would like to check what's called pro-Boolean. Therefore, you have to select one, and then it's only available. So if you don't select any of the two objects, it's not available. So select the torus, and then I go click on pro-Boolean. And now I have to choose what kind of operation I would like to do. Do I want to do a union? That means they will be welded together. Intersection, what do they have in common? Or I'm going to do subtraction here. So subtraction means the next one that I pick will be subtracted from it. So I choose subtraction, it's already on. Now I start picking, and I click on the sphere. Make sure you start picking off either by turning it off or use a right mouse click. Now you can see that my torus suddenly has the sphere subtracted. It is subtracted and has been nicely closed. So there is a Boolean operation. There's also Boolean, but they don't work well. Pro-Boolean has the big advantage that you can do it more than once. So more than once means I could, for example, get another standard primitive. This time I'm going to use a tube here. Sorry, no tube. I'm going to use a cylinder. So here's a cylinder. The cylinder I'm going to move downward a bit, make sure it nicely overlaps, not fully, but a little bit. So here it is, and place it here. So here's my cylinder, again overlapping with the Boolean. Now again I click on the Boolean, I go to modify, and in the list here I can still add more operands to the list. And I want another subtraction, start picking, and I click on the cylinder. So now it is the first one, the union. The first one says union, but it doesn't do anything. It subtracts the sphere and it subtracts the cylinder. Don't forget to turn off the start picking. The big advantage of this Boolean, first of all, it works really well. So the operation looks nice and smooth. So here's looks with edges on. But you can also edit it later on. So that works. If you select it and you go to modify, you can still start to pick new objects or change them or kick one out. But what you also can do is you can click on it, click on, for example, cylinder, and up here when it says operands, now you have cylinder. When you click on cylinder, you can still see its parameters. So that is the cylinder that went as an operator into the pro-Boolean. And for example, I can still change the cylinder, in this case, for example, the radius. So if I adjust the radius, you can see that the hole that it cuts is changing. Also, I can move it. But when I move it, I have to go into the sub. It doesn't work like this. So operands, I have to click on operands, then on cylinder, and then I can move it. So see the difference. I cannot, if I click on cylinder here, this is to access its parameters. But when I click on operands and cylinder here, I can move it. So it's both the cylinder and the sphere. See, it can be moved. And if I want to adjust the parameters of the sphere, I have to click here, and then I see the parameters of the sphere and make it larger and so on. So in the pro-Boolean, I can easily access all the operands that went into the Boolean operation, and here is my final object. It's called constructive solid geometry. So that is a geometry that the operands can be anytime adjusted. Okay, so I'm going to leave this. Boolean operation right there. I'm also going to place it back on my plane somewhere. How about here? Good. And now we are going to create our first rendering. And in the first rendering, we're going to render whatever we created here. The first thing is I'm going to switch into a perspective view. So I hit P for perspective, And now I'm going to adjust my perspective. Remember, select an object with Alt and middle mouse key. You can change the, you can orbit. With rolling, you can roll closer or so you can change the zoom value and adjust it here so that you see something like this. Okay, that is clicked and nothing is selected. Now we're going to render a picture, and of course we spent much time with render engines and how to make the right adjustments. But for right now, there's no light, there's no materials in the scene, so it will be just a little preview, nothing more. Before we render it, let's check out the parameters. It's here the teapot with the wheel that opens the render setup dialog. The most important thing right now, and it's already set again, I did that in part 0 of our course, and that is the render engine is set to Arnold. The next thing that I would like to change is the size in which the size of the picture that will be rendered. This is the output size. This is pretty small, 640 by 480. I'm going to change that to 1200 by 900. Okay, 1200 by 900 is the same aspect ratio as before. 1200 by 900. So whenever I render a picture now, it will be rendered 1200 by 900. Now, all the other settings, renderer and so on, we're going to leave them as they are, the defaults, and we hit render. And that usually creates a picture. You can see it up here in the progress bar. It's the rendering. You can see those little things that run around. They're called buckets or render buckets. And you can also see that every color of the object, that the classic object colors are the same as in the rendering, only it looks shiny. It looks as if it's a shiny plastic. The lighting that you see here is a reflection. There's a highlight in the sphere that actually is only where you would see a highlight, and that's because we have some kind of default lighting. It's like a lighting that comes from the same position that I am looking at. Because if I look at the scene from a different location, and I'm closing the render setup because this is the only thing that I wanted to change and make sure it says Arnold. If I look from a different location, like here from the back side, this is not the one I want, to render it again, you don't have to use the render setup. You can also use the render with the little spark here that's called render production. It's rendering with the same settings that I did before. Never click on the cloud render. I'll just show you what happens. Don't do it. If you click on the cloud render, it basically prepares you to render in the cloud something that is not that I haven't configured correctly. The problem is the next renderings all want to render in the cloud. That's after you click accidentally on the cloud, you have to click on render setup again and make sure up here it says production rendering mode and it says Arnold. So you have to kind of reset the production rendering mode to Arnold. Later on I'm going to show you also how to use the active shade and so on, but for right now it's production render mode Arnold. So when you accidentally click on the cloud, you have the next time you have to go to setup and set the target to production rendering mode and Arnold. So, but here you can render, and you will see when I render from this side, now the highlight or the highlight here in the material is now at a different location because it is again coming from the point that I look at the object. So it's a kind of default lighting there. Let's find a nice view that we want to keep. So I'm going back to the other one. If you want to make sure that the whole ground plane is in the picture, you have to do something, and that is up here under in my case perspective. In your case it should also say perspective. You can do a right click, and here is something that's called show safe frames. A safe frame is usually a rectangle that will show you how the picture will look like. So the aspect ratio, length and width, is the same as my rendering size. Even if I if I am smaller, it doesn't matter, it's only the aspect ratio. And here I can make sure that nothing sticks out. So if this one sticks out of the picture, in the final rendering it will also stick out. So make sure everything is inside, even though, here's maximized. And now I hit render production, and it will render our first picture. Those pictures, pretty fast, a couple seconds, 10 seconds or so. By the way, the render time, it says down here, render time 7 seconds. That is interesting when you, if you change something and suddenly the render time goes up, you can compare that. My picture, this is the one I want to keep, and I'm going to save it. To save it, here is the Save Image button. When you save the image, there's basically two, where am I? No, it doesn't matter, anywhere. Save it anywhere. There's two ways to save it. First, if you want to just have a preview, something that you quickly want to send to someone, you can, of course, make a JPEG out of it. So just render a JPEG. But as soon as this is a picture that you want to keep, that you maybe want to take into post-production, that it needs to be in better quality, never ever save it as a JPEG, because all the JPEG compression will be rendered into the picture. So there is a quick version that is just a JPEG to do something. You can also do a PNG if you want to. But if you want to keep it as a good quality and you want to print it or something like this, or you want to change the background, always use a TIFF image. So you choose a TIFF image, you call it whatever you want, blah, blah, blah. And when you choose a TIFF image and a name, the next question is, oh, I can't because I saved it, yes. Go to temp, save. As soon as you do this, it will ask you what is the color depth that you want to save. The usual one would be 8-bit. 8-bit per color means that every red, green, and blue channel will have 256 colors. 16-bit, of course, is much, much more. 32-bit, even more. Let's keep it 8-bit for right now. And do you want to store the alpha channel? What is an alpha channel? Let me quickly show you. Alpha channel means it defines, the alpha channel is a grayscale image, and you can display it. Up here is a button next to red, green, and blue, and when you click it, it shows you the alpha channel. The alpha channel is a grayscale picture that defines where is objects or foreground and where's background. And the background is always black and the foreground is always white. And when something is partly transparent, like the part that sticks out here, then it can also be gray. 256 shades of gray. That's the alpha channel. If you want to store this alpha channel, you have to save a TIFF image and make sure you choose 8-bit per color and store alpha channel. Okay? And then it will be saved with it. Okay? So, especially when the rendering took more than 7 seconds, if it's a 7-second rendering, you can as well save it as a JPEG. It doesn't matter, you can anytime reproduce it. But if it's something that took a little bit longer, then for sure you should save it as a JPEG. If it's a really important rendering and you want to make sure that it will be saved, you can also define a saving location at the very beginning. Remember where we set the size to 1200 by 900? Here's also, if you go further down, there's also a output, and you can say, you click on files and you define where it will be saved. Then it will automatically be saved to this location. Okay, so much for creation of simple objects, adjusting their parameters under modify. We even played with the compound object type pro boolean, created this boolean operation, and put it all together in a perspective view and saved it after we rendered it. Okay, hope you liked it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave me a like and comment there, and I'll see you in the next video.